out of, well, just Naples was the biggest close by, but as far as Sheringola was the Air Force base,
Okay.
and it was in the valley,
Okay.
and it was sprinkled. Air Force had properties all around,
Okay.
and it was handy to everywhere as far as tourism was concerned, but we didn't have that many opportunities.
For tourism at the
Exactly.
time. You were busy.
Exactly.
Is that part of Foggia? Am I pronouncing
It's that if you're familiar with Foggia, that was the big town.
Okay.
That was our Boston, if you will.
Okay, so that was where the biggest concentration of bombers was there, and you were near there on a smaller field, I guess.
Exactly. There was a satellite situation.
Okay. All right. So you served exclusively in Italy, is that correct?
That's true.
With the 15th? And is it true that the 15th Air Force was only based in Italy, or were they based in England for a while?
They came up from North Africa,
Okay.
and in the process of taking a bite out of Europe,
Okay.
and jumped across to Sicily and then on to mainland.
Okay. So you were on Sicily for a while.
Yeah, just in the sense of transportation.
Okay. All right. So you initially were a top turret gunner, but, and we'll get to more detail later, you ended up becoming a waist gunner on a B-24.
True.
Okay. Tell me, okay, you served exclusively in Italy, and tell me, were you drafted or did you enlist?
At that time, it was very proper to enlist.
So you did that.
And at a young age, you signed up, and they wouldn't call on you until you became 18.
Okay.
I think that was the triggering age. And at that time, you got a letter in the mail that your volunteerism had paid off. You were one of them.
Okay.
And we went in at that time.
Okay, so you went in when you were 18, and that would have been in the fall of 1943?
That's a good date, yes.
Is that correct?
That's accurate.
Okay. And where did you enlist? Where did you begin your training?
Actually, we went from here. It was independent travel at the time, and you grabbed a train, if I recall, in Waverly, an extension of Belmont, Mass,
Okay.
and took the steam train west to Fort Devens in Air, Mass,
Okay.
and unloaded there. And this was a mass pool of new recruits where they took a final physical, received uniforms and supplies,
Okay.
toothbrushes, and
Right.
all the good things
The
in
basic
life.
stuff.
Yeah, and housing there and testing, minor testing, because the big tests were later on in the south,
Right.
Gulfport, Mississippi, Biloxi, like that, for skills and so forth.
So you sort of had an initial staging area of, where was it in Massachusetts?
Air,
A-R-E?
AYRE,
Okay.
and it's until recently it was still functioning and breathing well, but it is now closed.
Okay. And where were you living when you were inducted?
Watertown, Mass. That was my birth area.
Okay. Why did you volunteer?
It was the thing to do.
What was the thing to do?
Yeah.
It was basically just, it was almost without question. It was a sense of duty.
All your friends were doing it,
Right.
had gone before or waiting to go. So everyone of the same ages was lined up, hat in hand.
Okay. And why did you pick the Army Air Force? Or did it
Oh,
pick you somehow?
No. I think it was the romance of flying.
Okay.
And everyone was going to be a pilot.
Did you hope initially to be a pilot?
Oh yes, everyone had the positive thought.
Right.
But much like my gunner friend Fingers, he was signed up for the same purpose, to be a pilot. And that was not going to come true.
Okay.
Because as they did in their programs of presentation, everyone was dangled this little gem of becoming an Air Force hero as a pilot, but they didn't tell you that they washed out 99% of the people that volunteered.
Okay. Okay. When you marshaled in Air, Massachusetts, how long did you stay there before you moved on?
This was just a question of getting brief housing, perhaps a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, a couple of physical tests, and from there, the long train ride to, let's see, where did they take us? To Texas.
Okay, so you went immediately to Texas from Massachusetts.
Yes, and from there to Mississippi.
Okay. How long did you stay in Texas? What was the point of going to Texas?
That was just a clearing spot, actually.
Okay.
Getting a new train almost.
Okay.
And from that time on, we moved on to strictly Air Force things.
Okay.
And they were great for housing you, getting you up early in the morning, and brief, how can I describe it? Marching around and doing physical exercises. And after that, it was testing. And no one could pass the test.
Now this was in Mississippi at this point?
This was Mississippi.
And you said Gulfport?
Gulfport, Mississippi, yeah.
So at this point, it's all Army Air Force guys?
It's all Army Air Force guys.
And you were taking various tests to determine whether you could become a pilot or
exactly.
be best
that was the choke involved, because it was destined. We had one man that was a dropout from the Navy as a pre-flight pilot, very talented, very educated, college graduate, and he didn't make it.
Really?
So this is how fine the line was. When they cut fine.
Right. So there were some surprises there, perhaps.
Yes, I guess so.
Okay. So you stayed in Mississippi for an extended period of time and continued training?
Basic training and testing.
Okay. And so at the end of the testing, where did you end up?
I think probably, and I'm a little vague, actually, I'm embarrassed to say it, but we were assigned a group of, can I sign off for now and see it? Oh,
right.
Don't you worry.
Okay. All right, going back to your boot camp experience, can you remember just what it felt like? Was it exhausting? Was it just, enjoyable from the sense that you were learning new things? Was it lonely being away from home? Can you just give me your impressions of what it was like?
Well, number one, it was my first occasion to be away from home. So it was a dramatic sort of pull and push mentally. But on the other hand, you were surrounded with mostly all people of your same age,
right,
and same desires,
right,
and the need to be a pilot,
right,
and all that sort of thing. And it just, you were with your own kind of people in your own age group, so it made everything smoother.
It's like an extended family.
Exactly.
Can you remember any of your instructors?
I remember our platoon sergeant, Sergeant Slaughter.
Oh, really?
Yes, play on words. And he handled the entire class, if you will.
Wow.
And he took full advantage of his rank. The sergeant at that time to us was close to God.
Right.
And he ran a tight little ship, but once again, we're Air Force,
Right.
not ground sloggers, and we were treated accordingly.
Right.
Future officers and gentlemen.
So that's kind of, they probably went a little bit easier on you than they might have
think
on
so.
the doughboys.
Yes, I think so. I think
Okay.
so.
Well then, did they basically then come to you and say that we're going to have you focus on becoming a gunner at this point? So that you knew that was to be your role? Or?
That word was never mentioned. You were always a potential Aviation cadet was the title of the desired position,
Okay.
and we were pre-aviation cadets,
Pre-aviation cadet.
subject to government rulings.
Right.
And after a series of tests and exams, you became viable for gunnery school.
Okay.
And they posted that as a reward,
Okay.
as against, I don't know what the opposite of that would be at that time. If you didn't get to gunnery school, where you'd go, I don't know.
But it was in Gulfport that they determined that you would go to gunnery school.
Biloxi and Gulfport, which are twin towns,
Okay.
and one was a testing facility and the other was the camp itself.
Okay. I believe that your crewmate, Frank, had said that he received his gunnery training in Texas.
This is right.
Were you with him at that point?
No, I went to Harlington, Texas, to gunnery school. I don't think Frank went to Harlington. He went to another gunnery school,
Okay.
if I'm right.
So you went from Mississippi. At this point now, how many weeks do you think you were in Mississippi? A couple of months? Or?
Say 3 months.
So now we're into 1944,
Yes,
clearly.
yes.
And then you're off to Harlington, Texas?
Harlington, Texas,
Okay.
and that was right down close to the border. And the main objective there was to introduce you to the 50 caliber machine gun
Right.
and the turret possibilities.
Right.
And you got to take your first flight in a AT-6, which is a early trainer.
Is
And
that like a fighter bomber, two-seater?
well, it was a two-seater, but open cockpit, and it was what they used to train
Okay.
the future pilots in,
Right.
to break them in. And it was exciting because you had a handheld 30 caliber gun with a ring that you could lock and unlock and swing the
Swing the gun.
And what you do is they take you out over the bay. I guess the water comes in a long ways and no great depth. And they had these bamboo or wood frame targets made up in the shape of aircraft.
Okay.
And you'd fire down on those
From your AT-6.
from the AT-6, but there was a little gotcha there. The process was so exciting to newcomers such as myself. This was my first experience in the air.
Right.
You'd start out at, say, 9 o'clock and fire at the target, and you would track back. And the pilot was very strong in explaining you don't track through the tail. And of course, everyone, not everyone, but many, many people were so hypnotized with the joy of flying or the fear of flying. There was some of that even then. It blew part of the tail off.
They shot right into the tail.
Oh, sure,
Oh
sure.
my God.
So
You were facing backwards, I take it.
yes, standing and facing backwards.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I'm glad that you didn't crash or anything like that. Can you describe your gunnery training in some further detail? How else they trained?
They tried to mechanize it to a great degree with film and gun cameras, and you would get a lot of classroom time, and the theory behind tracking and making a aircraft approach to another aircraft. And I guess that's pretty much it. It was all based on making you comfortable with the fact that you were in a position to kill another man from a distance.
Right. Did you, I believe that Frank had described you training with a machine gun that fired BBs.
Yes,
Is that correct?
yes,
You
there
did
was
that?
there was that, and the film camera gun that you would use. So there was many, and of course they didn't want to fire off too many 50 caliber rounds. The cost and time was fairly expensive. So as long as they could shoot BBs and shoot film, that was satisfactory for the early on training.
Did you actually use shotguns also?
Yeah, in the back of flatbed trucks, we had a circle a little racetrack, if you will, and they had towers that they had skeet. Thank you.
Right.
Skeet, and they'd load up there in the tower, and as you drive around, the people would shout pull, and he would release a bird, clay pigeon, and it would be your obligation to track
As you were moving.
as you were moving and try and hit it.
Wow. How did you do with that?
Not bad. I think the weakness to the whole thing is the track was bumpy, and every bump you'd hit, the shotgun would come off your shoulder, and of course then when it came time to fire, you'd be black and blue down to the elbow.
I've experienced that myself with a shotgun. It can hurt.
It brings your eyes to watering.
A tremendous amount of power to it. Okay, so once you completed your training in Texas, take us to the next step. What happened after that?
After that, I think the next phase was crew, and we came to Westover Field.
Back up in Massachusetts?
Back into Massachusetts, all the way from the far south.
To meet up with your crew, the guys
To
you're going to
meet
be crew with.
for the first time with the crew.
Okay.
And I was in the hospital there with an unromantic situation called a pionital sinus. And that's on the tailbone.
Oh.
Yeah. And there was a whole bunch of people in the ward with us. So apparently it was a new discovery for the Air Force, and they were doing a bang-up job with coccyx work. And
Coccyx work.
yes. And I found that I had 3-4 weeks of recovery time. Nothing to do but sit, or I was going to say stand,
Right.
at ease and read a lot. And at that time, I don't know if we started to meet our crew, but ultimately the crew came together in that area.
Okay, Westover, Massachusetts?
Westover, Massachusetts.
So you met Francis
At that time, yes.
Okay.
And I think that was all that really happened up there, because the next step was as we were formed into a crew, we were given the assignment. I don't know whether this was an option of the pilots or he was assigned, you will take your crew and do sea search. So we went to Langley Field, Virginia, and flew out of that fine old base. That was a beautiful brick barracks, very lovely, something we weren't quite used to, in fact.
Right.
And we went out over the ocean looking for submarines for primarily training for the pilots, I think.
This was over the Atlantic or down in the Gulf? Or?
No, over the Atlantic, out of Langley Field, Virginia.
Okay.
So you can get a feeling for north and south as far as the Virginia shoreline is concerned. And then I guess the crew was called into a briefing, and we were given an assignment, and that was the 15th Air Force. And we gathered our belongings and flew north. In fact, I remember we flew over New Jersey where the pilot made his home, and because he was able to phone ahead, his wife was out on the lawn with a bed sheet waving to us, so we came down as we came down as low as considered tasteful, and waved back, and he waggled the wings, and we flew off to Gander for our route across through the way of the Azores, which was a long, lonely flight. I never really respected the navigator until that time. Looking back on it, the distance over water, and we were all alone, you know.
A single solitary plane.
Yeah. Now, there were others out there somewhere, but we never saw them.
Right.
They weren't part of our covey, if you will.
Right.
And we stayed at the Azores for probably 4 or 5 nights
Okay.
or longer. It's very vague in my mind right now. And it was a very quaint and quiet little town in the Azores. Back then, it was. I've seen things on travel shows about the Azores, and it's quite lovely. But back then, it was really Hicksville, and
Right.
nothing was happening at that time except troops moving through on the way.
Right.
And that was pretty much it, I guess. And from there, we took off to Africa. We landed or flew over Marrakech, and we developed a leaky fuel cell, which was a blessing in a way, I guess, looking back on it, because we were grounded in Marrakech for a number of weeks,
Really?
2 weeks maybe, waiting for a fuel cell replacement to be flown in, because they didn't have anything in stock.
Right.
So
So you were in Marrakesh then?
Marrakech, and Fran Fingers and I went into town, and it was the closest thing to dirty, filthy. You can't imagine back then. And the poor people, of course, naturally were cut off from all the niceties of life, and all they had to deal with was what was left outside of a military garbage heap.
Right.
And we contributed as much to that garbage heap as possible, I guess.
Right.
Then I guess the pilot received his orders, and we took our aircraft, brand new, spanking, beautiful aircraft
With a new fuel cell.
with a new fuel cell, to Naples. And at that point, because it was a brand new aircraft,
Right.
too nice for greenhorns,
Right.
we were given a junker to fly to the little base.
So the aircraft that you brought across from the United States, you ultimately gave up possession of that aircraft in Naples. You
Exactly.
got a more battle-hardened version of the same plane
For transportation.
that took you to your final spot, which
Exact-
was, again, the name of the base again?
Well,
You named it at the beginning, and I'm sorry, I don't recall the name.
see,
It's near Foggia, but not
Yeah.
Foggia.
Foggia. Well, say Foggia because that covers
The whole area.
the whole area.
Okay, so at that point, it would have been, do you remember what month in 1944 that would have been?
The only way I can answer that is cheating. Date of induction, 8th of November, 43.
Wondered when you would have arrived in Naples. Probably the spring of 44, somewhere around
I would say,
because I know that Rome fell June 5th, 1944.
well, we have here date of departure, 23 of September, 44,
Departure from where?
the United States.
So you left the U.S. in, which was the date again, I'm sorry?
That was 23rd September, 44.
Oh, okay, so you weren't actually in Italy until the fall of 1944.
I think that's safe to say, yes.
Okay, and at that point we had pretty much shoved the Germans all the way north to the very top of Italy,
True,
near the Pyrenees, I guess.
True.
The mountains of
Yeah.
northern Italy.
and our return was the 25th of May, 45.
Okay,
And we left Naples to get aboard a Liberty ship.
when you'd all flown your missions.
We had all flown our missions. We stayed at the site of the Mussolini's World's Fair that was destined to come until the first shots were fired.
Right.
And then that fell right through the ground.
And where was that?
And that was Naples.
Okay, in Naples. Okay. All right. So at this point, you certainly knew that you were a top turret gunner, and you were ready to start flying your missions. And I believe it's true that at least initially, you knew you would have to fly 35 missions, but some of the missions, if they were considered to be particularly dangerous, would give you credit for 2 missions. Is that correct?
If you flew across the Alps, I think the unwritten law was you got 2 credits
For going over the Alps.
for going over the Alps. Then the fatality figures became more attractive, and they jacked up the ante, so they discontinued the double credit program.
So basically, it was 1 point for each flight, and that was it.
Yeah, and this was after you were into the program, so you felt that they had
Right.
done you in.
Right. Kind of stuck it to you a little bit.
But you have no voting rights.
No voting rights. That's a good way to put it. Okay, let's briefly just talk about the plane environment itself. These were not pressurized cabins.
No,
You had electrified suits to keep you warm.
this is great, except to turn up an electric suit is a labor of love, because the minute you put on a flak jacket, the weight of it pressing down presses the electric grid into your skin, and it's too hot.
Right.
Where in the extremities of the legs, where they hang loose, it's too cold.
The
So
flak jacket went over the suit,
over the suit.
and it restricted your torso.
Exactly.
It kind of made your torso too warm, and your legs
You became a grilled cheese sandwich.
became a grilled cheese sandwich. Okay, and obviously you had to breathe off of an oxygen supply because the air was so thin.
Yes.
You were flying at what kind of altitudes typically?
I think a fair figure would be 24,000 feet.
Okay,
You see, we had to get over the Alps, number one,
right,
and they wanted to stay up as high as possible to avoid interceptions and safety from ground fire. So 24,000 feet
was fairly typical.
was typical, yes.
Okay, before we get to specific missions or ones that you remember most vividly, I mean, clearly you saw combat. Combat for you would be having to shoot back at enemy fighters, I'm assuming. That was your job. So did you have some very close encounters with enemy fighters personally?
No, this is to take the glory away from the job. We never did see enemy fighters face on.
Right.
If they pointed the nose at you, then you'd fire at them. But if they were out there, and many of them were out at your altitude, talking to the ground people with the guns to give them the height and forward motion speed,
Right.
this was their service that they were performing at that time.
Right.
So the way it worked, I think, because of the shortage of gasoline for the Luftwaffe,
Right.
they would pick the day that they wanted to send up, and they'd also, because of the prestige of the target, would pick the day that they wanted to send up interceptors. And if you were flying on that day, you caught hell.
Right.
But God was good. We never had that situation.
So your main enemy at that point was flak.
Flak, by all means.
Because at that point in the war, the German
And
Air
engine
Force-
failure.
An engine failure, the vagaries of performance of your plane itself.
Exactly.
Okay, because the German Air Force was less of a viable force at that point in the war anyway.
They were slowing down to a
Lost a
crawl.
lot of their planes, their best pilots.
And they couldn't get off the ground for lack of gasoline.
Right, the gasoline was severe gasoline shortage.
Yep.
So that may have really been a blessing for you guys. That
Oh,
you
it
didn't
was.
have to fight off swarms of fighter planes.
Exactly. Unlike the 8th Air Force that you appreciate now, looking back on it, it was from the moment they got off the ground almost, they were in jeopardy from interceptors.
Right.
But we didn't have that.
Right. So is it true that you probably never actually saw an enemy soldier? Or did you?
We saw enemy fighter pilots off in the distance tracking us.
Right.
That would be the extent of it.
So nobody really close up, obviously. You never, other than maybe seeing prisoners on the ground,
Right.
you didn't actually see your enemy.
No, true,
Okay.
true.
Can you talk about some of your more memorable missions? Pick out 2 or 3 that, because of their danger or things that happened with the plane, you can remember really vividly, and give us
Well,
an example.
Vienna was highly emotional target for the Germans. Excuse me.
Sure.
And because of that, they had a lot of guns. I think it was up to 600 guns.
Anti-aircraft batteries?
Anti-aircraft battery.
Protecting Vienna.
You know. Then after that, there was Munich.
Oh, you bombed Munich?
Oh, yes. Stuttgart, Wiener Neustadt, like that. These were all prime targets. I was going to mention, if I may, Munich was another one. Blackhammer, Klagenfurt, Vienna, Valak, Regensburg, Graz, Linz, Verona. Now,
many of these were bad because of vicious anti-aircraft fire.
Exactly. And the bigger the city, the more industrialized, the bigger the ring of little boys servicing big cannon.
Right. And did you, was your plane hit by flak?
Ah, yes. Not in the sense of bringing it down ever, but we had ventilation holes punched because a flak burst was always, they'd throw up a box of flak and you'd have to fly through it.
Right.
And in so doing, you'd develop puncture wounds, if you will.
Sure.
The flak would differ from the tip of my little finger to a fist-sized piece.
Right.
And if you got caught with a bad size, you're in trouble.
Right.
And if it hit a vital part of the mechanism of an aircraft, you're in bad trouble.
Right.
But we lucked out and just had holes. We lost fuel. We had to come down early on the way home, but nothing that interrupted our lifeline, if you will.
And no guys on the plane were killed or
No,
wounded?
we lost our navigator who was flying with another group because he was a Mickey man, as it was called, which was radar in its early infancy.
Right.
And we lost him. He went out with the lead squadron and was never brought back.
I assume that many times, though, you saw planes going down all
Ah, yes, this was not unusual.
including some that you knew the plane from its markings. You knew you may have had friends on the plane.
Yes.
Did you lose a number of good friends or acquaintances?
The sad,
Casualty rate was quite high.
yes, even then it was high, but in the early stages it was extremely high
Right.
on a ratio, but later on it let up considerably so that you could go to dinner more than twice in a row and expect to see the same faces.
Right. Were you awarded medals or citations?
The Air Force is very generous. They reward you with the Air Medal after 5 missions.
Okay.
And it's totally unfair and imbalanced, I would say, in comparison to troops on the ground slogging for months in an area and getting 1 battle star. We'd fly over the area and get a battle star.
Right.
And I'd ended up with, for each 5 missions, you get a battle star.
Okay. So you would have 7 battle stars.
Yeah.
Do you still have those somewhere?
Oh, yes. I have the Air Medal in the box,
Oh, okay.
in the original.
Okay. All right. Okay. Can you
Excuse me.
go ahead?
The point I was going to make, and I lost the thought. these battle stars give you points for discharge.
Okay.
So we always would end up with a gigantic surplus of points.
Mm-hmm.
So we were easy out when it came time
Mm-hmm.
after the war was over.
But it was after the 35 missions, that was it. You had no further obligation, if you will.
They in turn would give you a stateside assignment, and much of it was training, and those that weren't too lucky or too skilled, they were too skilled, I should say, would be groomed to fly the big strato cruisers,
B-29s.
B-29s in
The Japanese theater.
Asia theater.
Right, so you weren't discharged. Basically, that just meant you were
Oh, no,
from
no.
combat duty, at least for the time being, to go back stateside and perhaps train.
Exactly.
It helps.
Or become an educator to younger men
Okay.
at that time.
All right, could you pick out maybe your most memorable experience of your time in Italy and just comment on that? Describe it briefly.
Well,
pick out your most frightening mission. Or...
I like to recall the trip to the Brenner Pass, which is something that we didn't fly to too often, and it was in northern Italy, and it was supposedly a milk run.
Mm-hmm.
And I was flying in the waist opposite the radio man, who was a bigger man than I was at the time,
Mm-hmm.
more body volume at least, and he'd stand on one side and I'd stand on the other side, and we flew over the trench that it looked like this is the Brenner Pass, and all quiet, very nice, and we released our bombs. We were on our way, and all at once, all hell broke loose, and he and I are standing there without aid of a flat jacket because it was so quiet and peaceful.
That you had taken the jackets off?
We had taken the jackets off,
Mm-hmm.
and when this burst of shell fire outside the aircraft started to pop, there were two men scrambling to recover their garments that were dropped on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, with hindsight, was quite humorous,
Mm-hmm.
but also quite deadly.
Quite deadly.
Yeah.
I believe Frank told me about, I assume you were on this mission, one where you were coming in with a couple of engines knocked out, and you had asked permission to land at another base.
And
which
we're
was
almost
initially
out of
denied.
fuel.
Can you speak about that one just briefly?
My memory is vague, but I do remember that the pilot brought the aircraft down, and the engines just all quit at once for lack of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it was one of those, thank God we made it. And that's why we always had such great respect for Joe Kalasha, our first pilot, yes.
So in other words, weren't you denied the permission to land at one base though because they were expecting a group of B-17s to come in?
I have memory of that, but I can't speak to it with authority, yes.
Frank said that the pilot decided to go ahead and land anyway on a runway that was mainly used for storage.
And we
Really
ran
food
off.
storage.
We
You
ran off the end. Yeah,
Right.
I do remember that.
But evidently everybody made it. No one was injured or
Yeah.
anything like that. So
It makes a good story.
it does. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. Good. Okay. All right. While you were overseas, did you stay in touch with your family through letters, etc.?
My mother was a widow, and bringing up my kid brother, as I used to call him, and he was only a little tot at that time, so she was living with him in Watertown,
Okay.
and I used to get off a brief note or memo to her every day almost.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, just to keep her getting mail, steady flow, and it really
It must have
made
come
her
from-
day. It made her day.
Did she send you packages with?
Yes, I
Food and things
used to
like
get
that?
care packages with peanut butter and all the good things in life.
Well, that's good. That's fantastic. What was the food like that you got on base? Was it pretty good?
It was warm.
It was warm?
Did I describe it violently?
No.
Well,
does that mean you didn't like it very much?
no, it wasn't. They made a decent French toast. Scrambled eggs had a tendency to be a little loose and runny. Powdered eggs.
Sounds like you can remember this pretty well.
Oh, yes. And what was the meat? The main meat was Vienna sausage. We had Vienna sausage 8 to 10 times a week, I would say.
Wow.
And that's giving extra days beyond 7.
So you must be kind of tired of Vienna sausage.
Yeah, Vienna sausage leaves very little left in my mind.
Okay. Did you guys otherwise have pretty good supplies to be able to just lead your life on the base?
Actually, we had no complaints. We had a PX of sorts, and you could get all the necessaries at a very reasonable price, or the Red Cross issued shaving supplies. We got coffee and donuts when we came back from each mission, and of course
you also were offered a shot of brandy.
I was just going to say, Old Granddad. Old Granddad was the favorite liquor, and I didn't drink at the time, so I saved. I shouldn't say I didn't drink, but I drank native cherry brandy. Was the drink of choice, with no choice involved.
Right.
And so I ended up with a gallon or more of medical whiskey, which was Old Overholt, at the end of the tour. And that was what we used to set off our party with.
Oh, I think Frank said the same thing.
Yeah, that would be accurate then, because
he didn't drink his at every mission.
No.
He waited till the end and then he had it all, I
Yeah.
guess, for your celebration.
Yeah.
That's pretty neat. Did you feel a lot of pressure and stress when you were flying? I mean, how did fear come into play?
No,
Or anxiety?
I can't claim that. I look back on it, and I remember Shorty, our nose gunner, who was older than the most of us, was up going to the John 2 and 3 times a night on nights that we were due to fly out in the morning. And he was
sick to his stomach?
No, just nervous urination, if you will. And we slept through. Youth was a very great cloak to throw over your shoulders.
Right. That's very well put.
Yeah, it was a nice thing.
You sort of fear nothing, because and there must have just been a lot of exhilaration and adrenaline that overpowered the fear.
This is true. This is true.
Plus the fact that you're doing a good thing and you want to just,
Well, we were winning the war.
Right. You wanted to finish it off.
Yes, yes.
Win it. Did you do anything for good luck? Carry anything special, or?
Yeah, I had there was a keepsake that was available on the Isle of Capri, which was a male penis cast in bronze, and I had it as a pull cord device on my jacket. And
so you had like a little yankable penis, basically.
Exactly.
Thing?
Yeah.
Do you still have that anywhere?
No, that was stolen. That was a collectible, unfortunately.
Somebody got a hold of that.
Yeah. I'll strike that line.
Okay, yeah, all right. That was still a pretty good one. That's pretty good. That's not the best luck a guy can wish for, I guess. What did you guys do to entertain yourselves? Play cards?
Yes, cards were big. Reading was bigger. We'd go to town whenever we could, and drink the wine, the 3-day-old wine, vintage.
Right.
And that was pretty much it.
Did you get a chance to sample? I guess Naples at that time was horrible shape, wasn't
Yes, it was bad.
The whole population was...
The harbor itself was dirty, bombed out, and because we bombed it when the Germans were there,
right.
And then when we took over, the Germans came back and bombed us in the harbor area, so it was just a brutal mess.
Right. I know that there were many examples of starvation, disease, prostitution.
Everyone was begging in the streets,
Right,
and
so
dirty
very,
and
very
ragged. It was a very desperate group.
Did you ever have entertainers visit your base?
Yes, but I can't honestly remember. I have a photo here in my collection of a USO group working on the mock-up stage that they had. But I can't remember any Bing Crosby type name.
Names.
No big names.
Right. Did you get a chance on extended leave to travel? And what were the most?
The Isle of Capri was the big one. That
Okay.
was that. That was great. All the homes were boarded up naturally from British entertainment people and business people that had homes on the Isle that were no longer welcome, if you will, were all boarded up. But we would go downtown in these little crossroads, if you will, in the Isle of Capri and have a night out on the town, if you will, which was quite a delightful experience. And it was such a quaint little community. It was marvelous. And it was away from the war by a 30-minute ferry ride.
Did you ever get to Paris or get over to France?
No, we never traveled outside our little Italian area.
Okay, so Italy was it.
Naples was the big trip.
Naples was the big trip.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you recall just a particularly humorous anecdote or event that happened? Why it could have been, whether it was on the plane or at the base or anything that just stands out as kind of a humorous relief from the war?
Well, you catch me off guard with that question.
Or pranks or anything you guys used to play on each other?
Well,
you must have played pranks on each other just to relieve boredom and things like that.
You know, one of the things, everyone had a sleeping bag, if you will, rather than sheets and that sort of stuff. So one of the things would be to stuff the bottom of the sleeping bag with soiled laundry just to fill it up. So the poor guy putting his legs down into it would only go part way before it was closed off to him.
Right.
So that was one of the big ha-has of the day.
Okay. All right. What was your opinion of the officers and your fellow airmen? Did you have a generally high opinion of who you were flying with?
Yes, they were delightful because they were all the same age group primarily. And the officers, our officers were...
Meaning the pilot and co-pilot?
Yeah, and the bombardier were gentlemen, and they were most kind and considerate. How can I say it?
What were their ranks, by the way?
They started at, we had a flight officer, our co-pilot. That's when they were squeezing down on the rank gifts. Right. And they made him a flight officer, which is a warrant officer with blue instead of brown. Okay. And he was one of the most gregarious young fellows. He was stunned when he didn't make first pilot. He was also stunned when he wasn't a fighter pilot, which that was his target. And that never came true. And because of that, he was a very humble, easy to talk to, great to be with. That's Chick Blancheri.
Chick Blancheri, that was your co-pilot.
A co-pilot, right.
Who was your pilot again?
Joe Kalacia.
And what would his rank have been?
He started out, he was a full second lieutenant. Okay. And he made first before his tour duty was out.
Okay. And he also was a good man?
Oh, he was a wonderful, he should have been a priest. That was the type of guy he was.
Really?
Yeah.
You stayed in touch with these fellows after the war?
Oh, yes, yes.
And you've seen them, I'm assuming, over the years?
Yes, indeed.
Well, that's fantastic. Did you keep any kind of a personal diary or anything?
No. In fact, having seen the chronological following up that Fran Villano has done, I feel humble because I have none of that. My major claim to fame is collecting photographs But
that's a good thing.
that's all I can say.
There's something about a black and white photograph that communicates something different than a color photograph, I think.
True,
Yeah,
true.
There's a certain power and immediacy to
Very
it.
graphic, very
Yeah,
graphic.
Very graphic, very just right there. And it captures essences so well. Okay, so you guys, after your 35 missions were flown, basically what happened? Did you all get, you sort of had a party and then you all dispersed to each to your own place in the U.S.? Or?
The trucks picked us up and took us to Naples for departure on a Liberty ship whenever it arrived. Mm-hmm. And this was on the site of Mussolini's World's Fair that never took place.
Right.
And a lot of the dramatic buildings were tumbling down, and a lot were destroyed by bombing. We stayed there, and if I recall, it was brutally rustic, muddy, wet. When it rained in Italy, it really rained, and with no paving of any sort to speak of, this place became a swamp, and we all lived in tents, waiting our names to be called to go aboard a pleasure cruise home.
Right.
And it was great fun, though, poking around and seeing the natives. At this time, they started to improve their quality of life.
Right.
And you'd go a long way with a carton of cigarettes.
I'm sure.
That would do a tremendous...
Real bargaining power.
Yeah, that had clout, definitely.
Okay. All right, so what happened after that? Once you finally got on the Liberty ship, take me on your journey back to the States.
Well, it seems it never was ending. You're just sailing for days and days. I would hate to speculate how long it took for us to get from Naples to New York City.
That's where you went directly to New York
Yes.
City? And the war was still on, or had the war ended by this point?
No, it was...
The war ended in early May, in Europe.
Yeah, in Europe. But VJ Day hadn't taken place.
But Germany had already surrendered?
Yes.
So in other words, after you flew your 35 missions, shortly after that, Germany surrendered.
Within days, Germany
Before you
surrendered.
went home.
I think they got the message that Filano and Corr were leaving and it was safe to come out of the woods.
Okay. All right. So on VE Day, you were still in Italy.
Yes.
Okay. So you took the Liberty ship back to New York, and then what happened there?
You had a medical shakedown, as well as giving up your leather jacket and the 45 and all those good treasures.
Oh, you had to get that all back.
Yeah. And the military had a technique of threat. If you don't turn it in, you don't go home, sort of thing,
Right.
which wasn't true as it turned out, but we didn't know that, so
Right.
you gave up all the good stuff.
I believe Frank said that your crewmate said that he kept his bomber jacket, that his son somehow got a hold of it.
Oh yeah, a lot of people. If you had guts, you kept it.
Okay.
Just put it at the bottom of the bag.
Okay. So you turned all your stuff in, but were you discharged at that point?
Oh no, we were sent home on leave for a week, 2 weeks.
So you came back here to Massachusetts.
We're back home to Watertown, and how was it? Oh yeah, before we went home, you had a full physical, and at that time they decided that the surgery that I had done in Westover Field was not doing well.
Okay.
And they were going to have to explore that again. So,
The coccyx, you mean?
yeah, exactly. So I went to Atlantic City for 2 weeks, fun in the sun, delightful. The Air Force took over the whole beach, and each one of the hotels were represented as an Air Force enclave, if you will. And
So basically this was leave that they paid, that they kind of
everything was paid for.
pulled out the stops on.
Yeah, and it was great. And a whole bunch of young people down there that welcoming the troops home, so that you had an enjoyable stay. And at that point, they decided I would go back in for another surgery. So they sent me to Plattsburgh, New York, which was an Air Force Army hospital.
Okay.
And it was populated with all released prisoners of war and wounded warriors and so forth, all Air Force. And I was taken in, and they opened me up again, and I think they were looking for buried treasure, but they didn't find anything good. I was then allowed to slowly heal and rest in the sun up there. Plattsburgh was a lovely town, and it all wound down peacefully, and we got on the train and came home and were discharged.
You were discharged back here in Massachusetts?
Right back in Massachusetts, right.
Was that before VJ Day, so you were discharged?
We were at the local hotel up there.
In Plattsburgh?
In Plattsburgh, which was quite pretentious for our rank and standing. And it was the eve of VJ Day. And all hell broke loose.
When they announced it?
Oh, yes.
There was a lot of partying?
Oh, yes, beyond belief.
Celebrating like crazy? And
You couldn't buy a drink. Everyone was...
buying you a drink?
Yeah, exactly. The hometown hero
Right.
reincarnated.
Wow.
It was wonderful.
Wow.
And once again, youth was a flaming glory.
So then you came back to Watertown.
Watertown, indeed.
Okay. Did you go back to school, or?
Let's see, I went back to school. I went to BU evenings because my mother, being a widow with a young son,
Right.
or young boy, my brother, she was in desperate need of financial support.
Right.
So I went to work immediately.
Doing what?
I was a parts manager at the Chevy warehouse, or General Motors warehouse in Cambridge.
Okay.
Let's see, what else was it? From there, I was always interested in jewelry, so I met this fellow who told me about an opportunity that was opening up in the jeweler's building, and I went there and applied for a job and got one in the watch department of D.C. Percival's, which was one of the oldest wholesalers in the city of Boston,
Okay.
servicing the trade. And that was my introduction into the jewelry, and the pinnacle of success in that business would be get a job on the road for the company, traveling with a line of jewelry. So that's what I strived to do, but unfortunately there was a lot ahead of me at the time, and I just sensed that I wasn't going to make it. And
Okay. So what were your courses in BU for?
Sales, business management.
Okay, so your business courses there. So you had this jeweler's job. Did you stay with that for a long time, or did you?
Yeah, that lasted a number of years, and I heard about this opportunity for a firm that sold to schools and colleges class rings, college rings, diplomas, caps and gowns, that line of the final days of secondary education. And I put in my name, and not expecting to get the job. I got the job, but it was strictly commission, no financial support whatsoever. So I worked for them. It was one of those things that, this was a big firm now, but they knew they had the handle tight in their fist, so they could turn the screws whenever they wanted to. They would sign you up, and your draw was modest. Your travel expenses were a little more than modest, and together you could live on the twosome. And then each June you get a nice letter from management. Thank you for your good services this past year. We admired your skills. Look forward to you coming back on the payroll come September 10th.
Right.
So you were divorced for the summer months.
Oh, okay.
So at that point, I would seek out any means of putting food on the table.
So you weren't married yet?
No, oh no.
Okay. Did you know Mary at the time? Or?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So you helped support your mom and younger brother.
Exactly.
Went to school at BU. Did you get a degree?
No. It was just
Courses.
courses.
Did you take advantage of the GI Bill in any way?
Other than a home loan, when that came up much later, that was about the only thing I really took advantage of.
Okay. So did you remain in the jewelry business most of your life?
Yes, all my life.
Okay, until you retired then.
Yeah.
Okay, now I assume that you did make many close friendships while you were in the service, primarily with your crew members, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And so have you guys had gatherings every few years?
Yes, we're very good on that, and we've had, I don't know how many years ago it first started, but also the reunion of, I've been active in it, the reunion of the Squadron. I go to that whenever it comes up, which is getting thin now.
And what is the squadron number was?
464th, 778th.
So this 464th Squadron of the 778th Bomber Group of the 15th Air Force.
Exactly. And they, up until now, have had a reunion every couple of years.
Well, now the 464th would have been how many planes
Oh, God.
in a squadron?
I'm trying to think.
A couple of dozen? Was it?
Oh, yeah, and more than that. They put up a flight of 40-odd aircraft.
Okay. The 464th was 40-some planes.
Yes.
40-some crews.
Yes.
And then the 778th Bomber Group, how many planes would that be? Or how many squadrons are in a bomber group? Do you recall that?
I don't. I honestly don't.
Okay. I would be curious.
Yeah, I could find out for you.
Okay. Okay, so you're continuing those relationships. You still see Frank occasionally, the tail gunner. And are some of the other, have you seen any of the other fellows within the last few years?
Unfortunately, our engineer, Mac, passed just a few years back. And he was our age also, but he was still quite young when he died. Shorty Douglas was the nose gunner, and he passed also. In fact, I have his daughter's photo here in my collection. And
how many of the fellows are left at this point?
well, let's see. There's Chick Blancheri, the co-pilot. Kalacia, the pilot. Volano, the tail gunner. Corr, the top turret or waist gunner. And that's it. There's only 5 out of the 10. We lost Williams early on. He died in that crash overseas. But
Pete Williams?
Pete Williams, yes. So.
Okay. Do you belong to any veterans organizations?
I do not, no. The only thing, I'm a member in good standing of the 464th. This is their periodical.
Oh, they put out a periodical for you?
They put out a nice newsletter.
That's great.
In fact, this is the AT-6, the training
really?
aircraft that
Wow.
was my first flight.
Wow. So if that was initially about 40 crews in the 464th,
Mm-hmm.
then I would have met, what did they have a meeting at a different location in the US every year?
Exactly, exactly.
And I know that your crewmate Frank had said that over the years you've actually been contacted by members of flak crews, German flak crew members, is that true?
Yeah, we've had them come and speak at our reunions, and
That must have been fascinating
yes,
in a way.
yes.
You never had actually seen them before.
well, no, they were little Boy Scouts.
So they were younger than you.
Yes.
Was that, did you get a lot out of that? Was it kind of good to
Well, it gave you
forge a bond with a former enemy?
it gave you a flavor of what they thought and the suffering that they encountered on the ground.
Right.
While you were up in the sky just shivering from cold, they were down below in the flames and the heat.
Right.
So it was an utter contrast.
Right.
But they too had an emotional involvement.
Of course. Yeah.
And, well,
That's interesting that they at least reached out to you. Would you say, Red, that did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general? Do you have any comments to make about that?
the only thing I can think of to speak on is the joy of landing your aircraft at home base and going to your shed or tent or whatever, and it was yours, and muddy or dirty as it might be, that was it. But there was no digging holes in the ground to hide from the enemy, or having bombs drop on you, or people shoot directly at you. They were shooting in the sky and hoping to hit you,
Right.
but it was different.
Well, do you have any philosophical thoughts about, about mankind, about why people get into wars, about the way the war was fought? Did it teach you anything about humankind?
Yes.
That you could speak to briefly?
You don't go to war unless you're young.
Right.
And it was a way of life at the time, and I won't use the word enjoyable, but it was a thing to do. Other than that, no way.
It's not something that you would want to have to repeat.
No, or have my children repeat.
Right. I mean, would you say that future American wars, Korea was a little different than World War II, Vietnam, very different, the Gulf War, different, but I'm assuming that having fought in World War II, it probably had some impact on how you looked at subsequent wars that America was in the sense that maybe you wished we didn't have to be in those wars, or you identified with the young men who were fighting, that sort of thing?
The last few incidents are remotely related to war, but they're politically correct possibly, but not emotionally sound. You lose all the drive, the buy bonds sort of emotion that we whipped up in World War II. That to me is all gone, and very little left in the way of support by the man in the street, if you can use that expression.
Well, that's very true. How do you think the service, being in the service and your wartime experiences, what primary effects do you think that experience had on your life?
Well, it was my first opportunity to be outside of Massachusetts,
Right.
and met all sorts of people, some highly skilled, some highly eloquent, others rather dull, but a mix. And that I thought was an education in itself. The travel aboard train and bus and so forth was exciting because it's something I'd never done before.
I'm sure that
Excuse me.
your training gave you a sense of discipline and teamwork, I would think, also.
This is true, and this is what they hoped for.
Right.
Whether or not they received 100% for their hopes, I can't say. But it was an educational event,
Right.
as well as an emotional event.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or any comment you'd like to make in summation that you'd like to leave as your parting thought?
My one regret, really, as we sit here, is I look back and failed to remember all the things that were happening to me and my friends at that time. Mm-hmm. It's starting to get fuzzy and gray, and that's a sad thing, because I know Frank is very good at recalling things, and I envy him that. Mm-hmm. But other than memory, I guess that's the thing that will go last.
Right. Okay, well, Red, we want to thank you very much for conducting this interview. It's been very beneficial, and I think we've done a great job here. So thank you very much, and I know the Library of Congress will appreciate this greatly.
Thank you again.